question number 12 is related to this, and is the goal to force children to do what they're supposed to by discipline, or to show them the right way and encourage them to choose wisely, or something else? Now, again, that's one of these questions that there's no simple answer for. I believe personally, just to put it in a simple framework, is that there needs to be a transition, a gradual transition as they grow from infancy to adulthood, from authority relationship to counseling and companionship relationship by the time they leave home. If you're still fighting to control them by the time they leave home, it's probably not a happy relationship, not a healthy relationship, and not good for anybody's spiritual or mental well-being. So I'm going to read in Ephesians chapter 6, the first 4 verses. And just as chapter 5 did, Paul, by the Spirit, addresses the one under authority first, and then the one who's responsible as head or in authority second. So Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." So right off the bat, you can see here that God is very, very interested in our parenting, in the development of a child to adulthood. And it's quite amazing that this commandment is right into the very core of the 10 Commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother. And because of its place in the 10 Commandments, there is actually a parallel with our responsibility to God and a child's responsibility to parents. And there's a very important reason for that, because parents literally are as in the position of God to us when we are little children. In fact, as obviously, the parents brought this child into existence. The parents created this being, and the parents have the deepest love and care. And so authority belongs in that relationship. And that authority is virtually absolute at the beginning, just as their control and care is absolute. And then there's this gradual transition. And so that's why I think, as the question raises this issue, what is the goal in what we're doing? Are we supposed to just force obedience to do what they should do by discipline, or to show them the right way, encourage them to choose wisely? I think we can see that the very, very beginning, that little child's thinking processes, of course, there's a divine image that we all carry, that God has given to us, moral character for himself. But it's to be formed and trained by parents. But again, there's this gradual lessening of authority. And I'm not qualified, certainly, to identify timeframes for this. But I'm just going to say just a few things briefly to any children who are still listening, because actually this is very encouraging to me. We naturally tend to put all the onus upon the parents. And that's valid. It's reasonable to expect the parents to be a lot more mature than the children. However, it's interesting that in the scriptures, there is a direct command from the Lord to obey your parents. This is right, but it's also good for you if you're a child. Why? Because actually your parents are showing you God's love and care to you. And that's interesting in verse 4, where the encouragement or challenge to fathers is to bring them up, bring the children up, develop the children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And so the whole relationship of the Lord to us is to be the pattern for us in families as well. And so we're all to learn from the Lord. We're to know him, to know his character, and as parents to display his character, to display his care, both his authority and his love. And so family is obviously God's plan. And we know that that's one main reason why Satan has so devilishly, so maliciously sought to destroy family. And tragically, he's been so extremely successful today. First of all, by having adults be disobedient to God, rejecting God's laws, God's principles, defying God, becoming wicked. And then as a consequence, and Isaiah actually brings out this, that God actually brings as a judgment upon people that just as he has been disobeyed and repudiated, so the same thing will happen within our own families and cultures. And so there's a blessing. There's a blessing for obedience. And I will say this again, that for any young person growing up, the single most important issue is your obedience, your submission to authority, recognizing that God has designed those in authority over you to provide you, to provide for you, to protect you, to lead you so that you ultimately can become a wise person yourself as an adult. And I was just reminded, because I just started doing personal reading through the book of the Proverbs again, and I was reminded of the fact that when our boys were growing up, we made a practice of reading in the Proverbs with them every day. And we would generally read half of a chapter each day, so it wasn't too long, but to go over those Proverbs over and over and over again with them. And I kind of enjoyed just starting into it again, because the Proverbs is written in the framework of a father to his son. My son, receive my instruction, and so on. And he teaches them the principle of the fear of the Lord. And so the blessing of the Lord is this, that if you are submissive to those who care for you, God will bless you. And it's actually one of the most important principles. And I remember reading this in another book, might have been a book by Dr. Dobson, that for those who get into adult life and they have never learned to be submissive, they have never submitted themselves to authority over them, they are the ones who are going to have trouble the rest of their life. They have trouble at work. They have trouble following any rules. They have trouble following the company procedures and whatever. They have trouble following managers. And many times people lose jobs because they can't get along, can't follow orders. And of course, we know this happens in society to a more tragic extent in the criminal justice system and so on. And so obedience is commanded as a child is growing up. Honor is a lifelong attitude to have to our parents, because they, despite whatever failures and weaknesses they may have had, they wanted to lead us. They wanted the best blessing for us. And ultimately, as Christians, they wanted us to know God and know the salvation of God as well. And so that's a general principle that is taught in the first three verses. And I'm just going to remind you of a verse that is found in Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 2. It's the opening up of the book of Isaiah. And it says, "The Lord has spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me." Now, in a perverse sort of way, I took comfort in that, in some of those years when we were struggling. I accepted the fact that as a father, I had responsibility and no doubt failed in some ways. And our younger son did rebel against us. He did go his own way in his later teen years. He did leave home, went on his own. And he came back a couple of times. Every time he came back and so on, there was a change in his attitude. And I remember one time when he said to us, and this is after he had some problems, and we had been careful to, I mean, I don't want to get too many personal reflections, but as I mentioned that, you know, Becky had struggled with confrontation with him and they tended to clash. And so for some years, I was kind of that buffer. But when it came time for him, when he actually left home, Becky realized that she couldn't control him. And she made a conscious choice to just seek to recover and reclaim whatever relationship she could with him. And once she relaxed that struggle, relinquished that struggle to try to control him, to try to prevent him from doing something wrong, and left it to his responsibility, there was quite an interesting transformation that took place. There came a stage where he would come and open up and start chatting, and he would talk to Becky. If I came into the room, he would clam up. And I realized that for whatever reason it was, he couldn't face me. And whether it was embarrassment or what a guilt that he had failed me or whatever. And so I had to just keep in the background and be glad that at least he was open to talk to Becky. And so I'm glad to say that, and I really intended to say this later in the message, but if I can just get this across to you, even if you have this heartbreak in your raising of your children, of a child that just will not be submissive and ultimately takes his or her own way, and they may hurt themselves badly and it may break your heart. There is a significant number of strong-willed children who in their late 20s and into their 30s return to the values that you instilled in them. They may not come back completely, but in a major way. And also the relationship can be restored. And we have had that joy. And it's interesting that Jeremy will call us, he calls me, 2 or 3 times a week. They live quite a ways away from us, so we don't get to visit them very often. But he talks to us all the time. And so it's a kind of a very precious thing to us now that he wants our involvement in his family. He wants us to visit. And so there's no strain in that sense, even though they're not going on as Christians. And so this gets back to this question: are parents really to blame for everything? And I'll have to just leave that for you to think about. If God himself had to make this lament that I have nourished and brought up children and they have rebelled against me, God is perfect in his love and his faithfulness and his goodness and in his administration of justice. And yet there is this sin, inherent sin within us, indwelling sin. And I will just say this again, before we go any farther, that sin principle is something every one of us have to acknowledge. And I'm glad that in the sphere of assembly life that we're familiar with, we still teach this very clearly, that we were born in sin, we were shapen in iniquity. And there is this stubborn sin that is within us that betrays us, and both we as parents and as children. So we have to acknowledge there are going to be conflicts. There is going to be challenges, and we can't avoid it. We can't deny it. So thinking then of parents, and Ephesians 6:4, it says, "And you fathers." A father has the ultimate responsibility before God. And it may not seem fair, because usually it's the mom who's spending most of the time with the children, who probably has the greatest impact upon the children, the greatest influence. But again, this is where I see that both father and mother need to be together and need to show involvement in the life of the children. And this is something that is very, very significant. I remember a research study being done quite a number of years ago now on contemporary family life, and they came to the conclusion that the presence and active involvement of the father has a significant impact upon the development of the children, their sexual development, their mental development, their social and spiritual development. And I think we can see in the tragedy of current life in the cultures that we are part of, that the breakdown of the marriages, the absence of fathers, the instability of the presence of a father figure in the families is a very significant, destabilizing, destructive influence on the development of the children. And I remember there was another study done on juvenile delinquency, and there was at that time, I have no idea what the situation is now, but at that time there was a significant contrast between the country of Italy with the social structure there and what it was in America. And this group was sent to examine the issues of juvenile delinquency, and they came back with one sentence: put the father back as head of the home. That was the conclusion they gave to deal with this very tragic reality of juvenile delinquency. And so I'm just going to touch on a few things, and I hope I can do it in a meaningful way. First of all, there's some dangers to avoid. It says, "Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath." What does that mean? Basically, it is saying the word to provoke is to exasperate, to frustrate. Provoke not to wrath means to exasperate your children so that they become angry, resentful, and frustrated. And so this is really based around a wonderful reality that children long for love and approval, not just affection, but approval in the eyes of their parents. This is instinctive. It's an innate desire to please mom and dad. And it's actually one of the most important threads holding the fiber of family relationship. And if there's one thing, I guess if I could emphasize, is that if you lose that in your child, you've almost lost the battle. Because if they lose the desire to please you, to be accepted in your eyes, they're frustrated, they can't please you anyway, then they will react against you instead of desiring to please you. So I'm just going to run down quickly. One of the things that causes this anger and frustration is showing favoritism. If a child feels like brother or sister always gets favored, and this especially is an issue if you have a strong-willed child who tends to be disobedient, tends to push the limits, tends to have confrontations, it's easy to get mad and stay mad and to be on that frustrated level with that child. Whereas the other child who's obedient, who doesn't cause trouble, it's so much easier to be kinder, to be more favorable to them, to show them, it's almost inevitable, but we have to try to guard against that. And of course, the great example of that in the Bible is Jacob and Joseph. And much of the hatred of those brothers against Joseph was because they saw their father Jacob as showing favoritism toward him. So every child, if we could achieve this, I think it would be wonderful. Every child should feel special in the eyes of his or her parents. A second issue is expecting too much. Now, this is particularly a problem for parents who are perfectionists or high achievers. And I guess it's one thing that, for whatever reason, we did not, as far as I know, we didn't impose that much on our children. Some parents are driving their children to be high achievers. And I suppose there's nothing too much wrong with that as long as the child is of the same kind of character. But if you are expecting too much, in the sense that the child feels like he can never do anything perfectly enough to gain your praise or your approval, then the child will opt out, and who will refuse to cooperate and refuse to be involved. A third thing is the problem of neglect. And again, this can happen so easily. There's so much pressure, whether it's both parents having careers, whatever it may be, that just has our attention so engrossed in so many other things, so many other responsibilities, that we just, as long as the kids aren't causing havoc somewhere, we basically let them do what they want and we neglect them. And especially if they have concerns, they bring something to us, or they want to show us something that they've done, and if they feel shoved away, they will try harder to get our attention, or again, there's this danger of reacting against us and shutting us out of their lives. And this can become an extremely difficult thing, especially as children grow up. It's one of the saddest things to see families where the children are basically living their lives totally in isolation and from their parents. And basically they're just existing in the same household together and not really sharing their life together in any way. And then a fourth thing that causes frustration is unbalanced or inconsistent discipline. And when I call unbalanced discipline, I'm thinking of excessively harsh or excessively lax discipline. And so this is where what we are as parents is more lax than the other, more harsh than the other. And it's very easy for us to end up contradicting each other and countering the attempted discipline or care of the other parent. So this leads to two things. It leads to confusion, and it leads to the opportunity for the child to play one against the other. And that's one of the things that we must absolutely avoid. Another thing that again, I know we had to work on this is there's always a tendency of letting things slide, letting things go on until you get completely frustrated. So if you allow a child to get away with, especially within subjection to your authority, if you let that happen all week, and by the end of the week, you're so frustrated that you just blow up in anger, or if you do it as a pattern for quite a while, and then you overreact and overcorrect, you're creating an atmosphere of tension, and so it really ends up like a guerrilla warfare situation where the kids know they can get away with it, and only once in a while, mom or dad are really going to get upset and come down hard on them. That's the kind of thing that destroys your authority and your ability to train them properly. And then, of course, making comparisons between children, that's a deadly thing as well. Each child is unique. Each child has differing abilities, intelligence levels, achievement levels. And one thing we've certainly learned is that each child responds to training according to personality. One child may only need to be spoken to. They'll immediately respond and shut down and stop what they're doing. Another child may need to be forcefully removed from what they're doing. And so we have to know who we're dealing with and know what level of authority we need to make. One thing that I have always hated to see is a parent ridiculing their child. I think sometimes parents do it out of embarrassment. Maybe the child has embarrassed them in front of other people. And so to get back at them, or whatever reason, I'm not sure why parents do it. Ridicule is devastating coming from mom or dad. We are that child's security. We are that child's protector. And I would say this, never, ever treat your child contemptuously, even in discipline, and especially in front of other people. So what goals should we have in parenting? Again, we have to remember, first of all, that it's a stewardship. It's an inheritance. And there's a beautiful verse in the Psalms that says that children are an heritage of the Lord. One of the things, looking back from my age now, is recognizing how short that time really is. It seems like you have these children forever, especially if you're tired out. But believe me, it goes by in a flash. And it's such a temporary stewardship. It's an awesome privilege as well as responsibility to be given these precious little lives into our care, to develop them to the best of our ability, and ultimately to have to let them go. And so, again, I've already mentioned foundational principles is that we have to acknowledge that inherent sin tendency and to realize that it isn't just that child. There is sin there that is actually at work within that child, trying to lead that child into a self-destruction, to bring out evil, to create that evil, to make that child a slave to sin. And so it's important for us to acknowledge there's going to be battlegrounds. We have to discipline. We have to curb and restrain evil as well as develop good. And of course, the individual temperament differences, I've already touched on this. There's one book that I don't know if it's still available. I found it quite helpful years ago. It's by Dr. James Duff. Parenting is Not for Cowards. And it was basically a helpful resource for parents who are trying to cope with a strong-willed child. And I've already mentioned that if there is any encouragement, it's to remember that they aren't always in your hands. They may seem like they're out of your control, but ultimately they are never out of God's hands. They are never out of his influence. And we can trust in God that whatever we have imparted to them and shown to them of God's love and care and of his truth through the scriptures, that God can use that and bring them back to some measure of that, at least when they get into their own independent adulthood. And as I mentioned, that does happen to a significant number of children like that. The final goal is really that child will be a self-disciplined person, prepared for adult freedoms and adult responsibilities. And so that's where we have to recognize it. Now, in the verse here that we have, there's two words that are used here. Bring them up. Well, that's another word, another phrase. Bring them up is to develop them, to nurture them, to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, it's kind of funny because the word nurture, I would tend to think of the nurture part as the tender, compassionate, cherishing part. But actually, the word there, translated nurture, is actually the word for child training or discipline, and generally refers to physical discipline. Now, I'm hesitant to make any comments about that. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world, but where we are here in Canada, physical discipline is still legal, but it is so strongly rejected in our culture. And there is so much abhorrence of it that we have to be extremely wise in any physical discipline of the children. And so while it's clearly taught in the scriptures that it is appropriate and valuable, we need to at least acknowledge that it must be done with extreme care and control. If you are angry, if you're in a rage, do not touch your child. Do not lay hands on that child. Do not handle that child in any way. You must be in control yourself. And there's really, I guess if I could put it this way, if we train our children to be obedient by word when they're very little, there's probably very, very few times we would really need to physically discipline them. And what I mean by that is when a child is very, very young, you can't reason with them, and don't spend too much time reasoning with them when they're infants. They have to learn authority. And one of the simplest things is whenever you give a command. Now I know I remember hearing the 1, 2, 3 rule where you give them 3 times. Now I can understand maybe once or maybe twice. Make sure the child actually heard you. That's fair enough. But I do not believe that there's any virtue in continually repeating yourself. It only teaches the child that they can just keep on avoiding obedience until it gets to a certain level where they have to obey. And that's usually when there's a further consequence other than just your voice. And so the principle basically is, for a very young child especially, is when you give a command, tell them to stop doing something or not to touch something or whatever, is to combine the command with an action where you physically take them and move them away, or just tap them slightly on their hand or whatever they need to give them an impression that they can't do this or shouldn't do it. And so that training is actually very important. I remember basically they should be trained by the time they're 2. It may sound absurd, but it's actually showing the importance of that child recognizing the authority of the parent over them. So any kind of physical discipline certainly should be reserved for a deliberate defiance of authority and a known rule that's in the home. And so I won't say any more about that, except that be very, very cautious, very wise in any physical discipline. There's other things that we can do, and this is especially valuable as the child grows up. And one of them is called using the law of sowing and reaping, the logical consequence. An example, if a child breaks something or loses something, you can say to that child, okay, you need to pay for it, or you need to do something else to repay this. And so if you cause something to be destroyed through your carelessness, then need to work off the debt or something like that. If you impulsively spend all your money on something, well, then you'll have to wait till you can afford the next thing that you want to buy. And if you fail to come when you're supposed to come to meet a deadline, well, then you suffer the consequences. I guess one of the things that is very important is children need to learn to be responsible for their behavior. If they are irresponsible, they need to pay a consequence that is a logical consequence of whatever they've done. And then there's another thing that's commonly done, a timeout, removal of privileges. I'm sure we've all done this. And that's a fair thing to do, because that idea of a timeout, it reinforces the reality that some behavior that's inappropriate or a bad treatment of another child or whatever, it results in a loss of privilege of being with others. And so that also provides an opportunity for repentance and the experience of reconciliation and restoration to the group and its activities. And so these are things that do work and can be beneficial, because basically, again, you have to think about adult life. In adult life, what happens when someone does not behave appropriately and treats other people wrongly? Well, they end up losing their privileges. Either they lose their job, or they lose their place in the family, or they lose their place in society, and they end up in jail. And so that principle follows through. The second word that is used, the word for admonition, is the word for training by word, counseling, and warning. And so I've already made some comments about that. But I also want you to think about this, that when we think about discipline and training and so on, we need to think of the positive side. And this is where I think maybe that our focus sometimes is wrongly placed. We need to develop their conscience. I remember Romans chapter 16 and verse 19, where Paul says to the believers there, he says, "But I would have you to be wise unto that which is good and simple concerning evil." Now, the word wise is the sense of being experienced. You've developed in this. You know this very well. You're familiar with it. Simple means you're inexperienced. You don't touch it. You stay away from it. And so maybe you should ask yourself the question, what does being good mean to us? It's our responsibility to develop our children in positive goodness, to show kindness to others, to show care, to show fairness, as well as turning away from evil. I remember, I think this might have been Dr. Harley again, made a comment that I thought was helpful. He said that a lot of the things that we want to see our children develop in could be summarized in the word thoughtfulness. We want them to learn to be thoughtful of other people, to be caring, to realize the impact of what I'm doing on my next door neighbor, my friend, my brother, my sister. And so if we cultivate that and develop that sense of thoughtfulness, we're actually having the right focus. Now, someone has put it quaintly, we need to learn to catch them doing something right. Focus on rewarding good attitudes and good behavior. Spend more attention on their positive moments and their positive habits and so on. And we can do that by just showing sincere appreciation, showing approval, expressing approval, showing affection. And this can help nourish the vital relationship that we have with them and their will towards what is good. And I've already mentioned the importance of showing confidence. Give the child a responsibility, show them clearly how they can do it and what you expect of them, and then show confidence in them to carry it out. And it's something that I can say from my own experience clearly that had more effect, very much more effect upon us growing up in our home than it did if our parents had continually nagged at us to not do this or not do that. And so I think that's an important thing. Now, there's other things. I realize my time is basically gone. One thing we should do, and this is an expression, I will put it this way, training in family court. Our children need and ought to be able to learn a sense of justice and the wonderful balance of justice and mercy. Punishment, discipline should not be just automatic and blind. I've seen or read of, training modules for children that basically have just like this automatic discipline that's always done for the same thing, no matter what. And to me, that's a very silly framework. Just think of the scriptures and think of your life and how God works with you in your life. And so just thinking about this, whenever something goes wrong, you need to allow your child the opportunity to express himself, to explain himself. But of course, we must strive for honesty and respect. Discipline, decisions that are made, they must be seen to be fair. I remember someone who was a judge making this statement that justice must not only be fair, it must appear to be fair. And that's an important thing with our children as well. And then, of course, when a child is broken and contrite, mercy may have a greater power than carrying out a punishment. But they've already showed themselves to be humbled or broken. And so basically, I'm saying that we need to let our children get to know what God is like through us, through our character. And finally, the last thing I just wanted to leave you with was training by parental example. And I think we know this, but we can't stress it too much. And I'm just going to remind you of a couple of verses. Philippians 4:9, Paul says to the believers there, he says, those things which you have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do, and the God of peace shall be with you. And again, respect is a two-way street. I believe it's important, it's vital, even if it's just a young child, treat that child respectfully. Show respect. Respect your child as a developing adult. And be honest. Whenever, be real. Admit mistakes. It doesn't demolish your image. It enables that child to see you more realistically. And then, of course, we do have a desire to teach them spiritual priorities, but we have to live out those priorities as well. And so authority must diminish. It must give way as children progress to adulthood. But our example can continue to have a lifelong benefit for them. And so I'll just have to leave that with you and trust that as we think about this, we'll remember that a couple needs to be together, needs to cultivate their own relationship so that you genuinely are in love with each other, your relationship is secure, then your children will be secure. And they will be able to develop in that atmosphere of love and security. And they'll be able to handle the curbs upon them that are necessary as they develop. Let's just pray. Our Father, we bow in your presence. We entrust ourselves to your grace and your faithfulness. And we know that each of us are limited and fallible, and we certainly aren't always wise, and we don't always handle others as we should have. But we do acknowledge your faithfulness to us and the goodness that you have manifested even in our families. And so we would entrust ourselves and our children to you and our grandchildren and pray that you might have mercy upon them. And in such a wicked age as we are in, that they might know what is true and be preserved and protected. We entrust this to you in our Savior's precious name. Amen.